Welcome. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth. And today we are going to go back to the very first civilizations in the archaeology of the origins via this book by Glenn Daniel. And by this we mean, as it's written on the inside of this book's dust jacket by Glenn Daniel, when we speak of the origins of civilization, we mean the origins of the first literate town dwellers. Some 5,000 years ago, Sumer, the earliest civilization so far known to man, took root in southern Mesopotamia. Sumer, the earliest civilization so far known to man, took root in southern Mesopotamia, not ancient Egypt, but that did follow. The Sumerians had city-states, specialized craftsmen, cooperative irrigation works, ceremonial centers, and a written language. In this book, Dr. Daniel carefully investigated the world's first 7 civilizations, showing what archaeology has revealed about their origins. These civilizations arose in the Old World, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. Is that something to do with the Indians, the Brahmins, the Hindus, etc., and China, and in the New World in Mexico, Yucatan, and Peru, South America. Each of these 7 societies has left fragments of its existence for the archaeologist to study, and the layman, that's the ordinary Joe, everyday Joe, you and me, to ponder. Today, in Iran, Iraq, Palestine, Turkey, Russia, and Bulgaria, one can see Sumerian tells or signs, evidence of their influence. These mounds were formed over the centuries by the wearing down of clay buildings, each set on the remains of its predecessor. The towers contain Sumerian bricks, potsherds, and tablets displaying cuneiform, the world's oldest known writing. The winged griffin of Egyptian art, inscribed sewers from the Indus Valley, advanced bronze metallurgy dating back to the very beginnings of Shang, China, the 1961 discovery of corn's wild ancestor in a Mexican cave, the remarkable jade objects of the Olmecs, emphasizing human figures with snarling jaguar-like features. Each offers fascinating clues to the way of life of these first civilizations and the relationships one to another. Dr. Daniel poses several questions. How, why, and where did barbarian societies make their leap forward into literate, town-dwelling communities? Were the 7 earliest civilizations linked in any... Look at the back jacket, back flap. Way. Where did the people of the first civilizations come from? Did the Vikings or other Europeans reach the continent of America long before Columbus discovered it? Dr. Daniel presents his own views and those of his contemporaries, probably the same in his field, showing how man and advanced archaeology have solved some of the world's greatest mysteries. A little bit about Glenn Daniel. He was a renowned British historian of archaeology, was a fellow and director of studies in archaeology and anthropology at St John's College, Cambridge, England. Editor of the journal Antiquity since 1958, he appeared frequently on radio and television and was the director and educational advisor of a British independent television company. Among Dr. Daniel's many books are 100 Years of Archaeology, The Idea of Prehistory, The Megalith Builders of Western Europe, and 2 books recently, or at that point or thereafter, published by Thomas Y. Crowell Company, Man Discovers His Past and the Origins and Growth of Archaeology. So let's have a look inside this book. Contents with illustrations. List of illustrations. The ziggurat of Ur after excavation and restoration and so forth. And there's more. Sources of illustrations. Preface. This book is based on 8 lectures given in the University of East Anglia, Norwich, in Michaelmas term of 1965 and repeated afterwards in the University of Cambridge. A summary version of them was broadcast in the third programme of the British Broadcasting Corporation in the spring of 1967, and the text of these summaries was published in The Listener. This course of lectures was the first series of public lectures given at the University of East Anglia, which started in 1961, and in planning it with the Vice-Chancellor, the author's friend and colleague, Frank Thistlethwaite, they decided that while they should try to attract as wide an audience as possible from both inside and outside the university, they should provide a course which demanded some thought and concentration on the part of the audience. It was all too easy, as every archaeological lecturer knows only too well, to produce a popular lecture with the aid of slides showing buried treasures, strange scientific techniques, history emerging from the ground. They wanted in this series to use the popularity of archaeology to direct the serious attention of people interested in man's past to this one central problem. What light can archaeology throw on the origins of civilizations? They did not know what reception they would have or receive. There might have been nobody there, no one turned up, or a large inquiring audience on the first night and nobody afterwards. In fact, all 8 lectures were given to a very large audience. The author hoped that in their present form they would reach that far wider audience of non-professional archaeologists and historians for whom they are intended. This is not a book for specialists. His professional colleagues will find mistakes of fact and interpretation in every line if they are so inclined. If that's what they're looking for, they'll find it. These lectures were given to non-specialists, to ordinary university students reading physics or geology or romance literature, to ordinary people, housewives, bus conductors, the man who drives the author around in a taxi in Norwich, in England, and the man who cooks some spring rolls and barbecued spare rib in a Chinese restaurant. But in his Norwich audiences, there were serious students anxious to take the matters he discussed further by conversation and by reading. And so after most of the lectures him and his friend held, seminars where points summarily mentioned and the lectures were expanded and differing views were talked about. The substance of most of the points which arose in this way are given in the seminar notes printed after the main text. For those who do not wish to plough through these detailed notes, he's appended a short list of books for further reading. The lectures were illustrated with lantern slides, and some of these illustrations are printed here in the plates within this book. Their intention is to illustrate the variety of person and performance among the first 7 civilizations of man, and the author says, let him emphasize the theme throughout is not the content and development of these civilizations, but the light archaeology throws on their origins and interrelations, and therefore on the general process of Cenoicism. In the preparation of this book, the author had been very glad to be able to continue the cooperation with Mr. Mr. H.A. Shelley, which went on for years in the pages of a magazine or book called Antiquity, probably a magazine, and many volumes in the Ancient Peoples and Places series, and he's thanking him for the 14 maps he drew from GD, May 1968, St. John's College, Cambridge. That's the author, right? Chapter 1, Savagery, Barbarism and Civilization. Just going to go through this real fast. In a recent article way back then, in the Spectator, Professor Stuart Piggott referred to archaeology as the science of rubbish. He was indicating that archaeology is the study of what material has been left behind, of the minor monuments at time which antiquates antiquities, and have an art to make dust of all things, have yet spared, of the dead bones which have quietly rested under the drums and tramplings of 3 conquests. To quote Sir Thomas Browne, you may remember Francis Bacon's definition of what archaeology was concerned with. Antiquities, he said, are history defaced, or some remnants of history which have casually escaped the shipwreck of time. It is with these remnants of history, this rubbish that has escaped the shipwreck of time, that this book is concerned. When the author saw the title of Professor Piggott's article, he was immediately reminded of the fine condemnation of archaeology once uttered by that most amusing American professor of anthropology, the late Ernest Alfred Houghton. Archaeology, he said, implies an interest in the obsolete paraphernalia of the past, which to the multitude stigmatizes its students as unregardful of the necessities of the present, the senile playboys of science rooting in the rubbish heaps of antiquity. He was one of those senile playboys, and he was asking This is the author talking here. Asking all to root in the rubbish heaps of antiquity with him. To dig archaeology together to find what light it throws on what the author regarded as one of the most important historical problems, the problem of the beginnings of the ancient civilizations of man. Their theme, then, was what archaeology, the study of the material remains of the human past, tells us about the origin of the civilized societies of antiquity, about the origin of the earliest and first civilized societies, that is to say, about the origins of civilization itself. And he gives more information there. Until Lubbock's time, man's history was conventionally divided into modern, medieval, and ancient. Lubbock defined the fourth division, that of prehistory, a kind of misnomer. It really means pre-written history. Writing is an achievement which came late in man's cultural development. The earliest surviving writing comes from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, right? And is not earlier than 3000 BC. Writing, then, is a skill which is some 5,000 years old. Man may have come into existence perhaps in Africa, 1 to 1.5 million years ago. Homo sapiens was certainly in existence 30 to 40,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. At a very conservative estimate, the prehistoric past of Homo sapiens, or human beings, is 10 times as long as written history, and the prehistoric past of man is the genus Homo, or genus man, very much longer, or genus being, very much longer. It is the final stages of the long preliterate past that concern the author here, or those here, and it is the testimony of the spade and not the testimony of the written word that suggests to all, or to them specifically, the views they should now take about the origins, or they should have taken about the origins of civilized societies. By the time writing had arrived and recorded history is upon us, civilized societies have already been born. There is a difficulty here, difficulty of method and approach. The historian proper is suspicious of the historian improper, if the author may so call the archaeologist who copes with the science of prehistoric rubbish, the scholar who deals with pots and pans and ruins and invents names for the people who created non-literate cultures. And on a side, the archaeologist is suspicious of the broad approaches made by the historian and philosopher of history, and often retreats to his taxonomy and typology, and takes refuge in the minutiae of ancient material culture. This is why the problem we are studying within this book is so fascinating and so fraught with dangers and pitfalls, for it needs archaeological knowledge and a breadth of historical thinking. We may not achieve the union of these, but let's try. Our picture of man's remote past is derived from archaeology, with all its associated scientific disciplines such as, for example, human paleontology, geochronology, and the study of faunal and floral remains. The relative values of the material and literary sources for reconstructing the past of man vary from the beginnings to the present day. In prehistory, as we have said, as the author has said, archaeology is paramount. Indeed, prehistory is prehistoric archaeology. In ancient history, archaeology is of very great importance, and sometimes much of it is referred to as proto-history. We cannot solve or begin to see our way towards a solution of the fascinating problem of man's emergence from savagery through illiterate barbarism to literate civilization until and unless we appreciate what archaeology has to say. How much it has to say, and sometimes how little. We will speak of the limitations of archaeology later, or the author would speak of the limitations of archaeology later. The limitations of the written sources, on the other hand, are more obvious. They just do not exist before 3000 BC in the Near East. The antiquity of man's first civilizations is buried in the pre-literate past, and is what archaeology tells about the last stages of that pre-literate past as it emerges via proto-history into history that is our concern. The word civilization is by no means a very old one in the English language. Boswell reports that in 1772 he urged Dr. Johnson to insert the word in his dictionary, but the doctor declined. He preferred the older word civility, and this like the word urbanity, reflected the culture of the townsman in urbs or civitas, as distinct from that of the barbarian, the agricultural rustic. It was of course an invidious term, and here the author uses civilization and urbanization as objective and specific terms without the overtones which we associate with the words civility and urbanity. We do not suggest that the people of the first civilizations, the literate town dwellers of Ur and Mohenjo-Daro and Anyang, were necessarily civil or urbane, but they were literate and lived in towns and were the first people to do so in the long process of man's cultural and social evolution from the darkest savagery of the early Paleolithic. Remembering the book of Genesis, where Cain was ousted out of the Garden of Eden, went to the land of Nod, and he found himself a wife, had children, and he created the first village or city, supposedly. So it went on from there. So yeah, it would have started through his descendants, who probably merged into Mesopotamia and built a nation there over the centuries. And he gives the terms of civilization and culture. And he talks about Lubbock again. Lubbock, though he was an archaeologist among many other things, was writing at a time before many of the great archaeological discoveries of man's earliest civilizations had been made. He wrote, too, at a time when, though Charles Darwin had disturbed complacent people by the publication of his The Origin of Species in 1859, and Charles Lyell and John Evans had further disturbed people by the acceptance in that very same Annus Mirabilis of the great antiquity of man, there was a fairly clear and a fairly comfortable idea as to what civilization was. It was Western Europe, and the Victorian age was the proud pinnacle of their edifice, Western civilization. We, all of us, in a wide variety of ways, still use this tag phrase, Western civilization. We are proud of it, ashamed of it. It is the great glory of democracy and Christianity. It is bourgeois capitalism. We are ready to die for it. It is effete, and already dying on its feet. It all depends on how you look at it. And in many a place, we still encounter the traditional history book picture of the evolution and components of Western civilization, the three components from Athens and Rome and Jerusalem. Athens gave Western civilization its intellectual and artistic heritage, Rome the practical achievement of government and law, and Jerusalem its faith and morals. Viewed thus, it is all as simple as that, and the notion is often repeated in this simplistic form. But even in the 19th century, this over-simple story of the three civilizations which lay behind the medieval and modest Western Greek, Roman and Hebrew was obviously not a complete and full story. The humanist and the Christian, even without detailed archaeological sources, and relying on the dubious historicity of the Bible and the more accurate observations and descriptions of men like Herodotus, who was actually believed to be telling the truth, everything he said was fact, when he was actually a liar, deemed a liar eventually. Knew of Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and of Medes and Persians, he's an exaggerator. The humanist and the Christian, even without detailed archaeological sources and relying on the dubious historicity of the Bible and the more accurate observations and descriptions of men like Herodotus, knew of Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and of Medes and Persians. Most scholars had forgotten, or had chosen to forget, that in the period between 1492, it's when Columbus discovered America supposedly, and 1530, the period from Columbus to Amerigo Vespucci, civilizations had been discovered and in part destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors in Central America. It is, incidentally, one of the curiosities of the development of the study of man's antiquity in these British Isles in England, that they have hitherto paid very little attention to the pre-Columbian civilizations of America. The average cultivated reader probably knows even less about the Maya, the Aztecs and the Incas of America than he does about the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Harappans, and the people of the Shang civilization of China. But if the Victorians thought little about what lay behind Greece and Rome and the Medes and the Persians, and paid little attention to Central America, they had some vague ideas of the antiquity of civilized life in India and China. Had not China invented paper and gunpowder, and were then not sahibs and Hais who had seen something damned interesting old remains in the jungles of India, and was there not among a few feeling that rope tricks and sword swallowing fakirs apart, there was some very ancient wisdom in the East, and so forth. When the author speaks then of the origins of civilization, he meant the origins of the first literate town dwellers, discussing what Gordon Child called the urban revolution. We'll see what the author preferred to call the process of Cenozoism. It was not a revolution but an evolution, and one that took place in several parts of the world. Our problem is how and why and where and when barbarian societies made this leap forward into literate town-dwelling communities. And here is the nub of the question: did this forward leap take place once only, or did it take place many times? We have already begged another question by referring, or the author has already begged another question by referring over and over again to barbarism. The Greeks knew what they meant by barbarians. They called them barbaroi, which is the same thing as barbarophonoi. That is to say, the people who spoke a foreign or barbarian language, the people who went ba, ba, ba. That's what Roy Casagandra says on his video on YouTube, The Rise of Islam, but he used the Romans. The Romans came across these barbarians, and they didn't like the way they spoke, and they described it as ba, ba, ba. And someone came and said, oh no, that's a load of rubbish. Well, here it is, by a much older writer, so many years before Roy Casagrande. The Rise of Islam stated the same or similar. So you better shout us dinner, take us dancing, romance us, because you said that we're talking a lot of rubbish. You know who you are. The Greeks met these people on the frontiers of the civilized world and had names for them such as Samaritans or Sarmatians. I'm sure it's supposed to be Samaritans, I'm not really sure. Sarmatians and Scythians and Celts and Ligurians. Herodotus gave an account of a people living in a lake village in Greece, and here he was writing an ethnographical account of what we nowadays would call a Neolithic or Bronze Age community. The barbarians whom the Greeks met had many things in common. They were illiterate, they didn't live in towns, some of them were nomadic and drank mare's milk, female horse milk, and some of them surprisingly wore trousers. But the worst crime was that they didn't speak Greek, and that showed clearly how barbarians they were. Yet the barbarians, although they had no talents of writing or literature, were accomplished in many arts and crafts. They had domesticated animals, indeed many of them were horse riders, and they cultivated grain. Some of them, like the Celts and Scythians, had developed a remarkable style of art. They were indeed near civilized, or so thought the Greeks. Chapter 2, the discovery of the first civilization. In the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis are these words: And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar or Sumer, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. These words were set down in Hebrew not earlier than 800 BC. Well, we believe it was the original ancient, very old Tab Asher or Aramaic, not the Hebrew, because as we showed in our other video, the Hebrews were a movement of people. It wasn't a language. Movement of people. The descendants of Noah, one of them being the son of Apashkad, who was deemed the father of the Hebrew, who then eventually had a son called Heber, or Heber, Heber, who then merged with the people of Chaldea, Ur of Chaldea, Abraham and his family. Well, they're all related anyway, and then they went to the promised land, the land promised by God to be given to Abraham. So they were called or those who crossed over, made a passage, made a journey. Okay? They made a journey to another land, from Ur of Chaldea to the land of Canaan, which may have been descendants of the Egyptians, not the Hebrews. Okay, so they went there and they adopted and adapted their language, and they called their god El, which was a pagan idol god. Idol. They took on the Canaanite language. That's where they got the word El from, and they scripted or scribed the scriptures wrong. Okay, their name wrong into the scriptures, because the original name was from the original ancient, very old Aramaic, Tab Asher, El, E-I-L. That was the name of God, not El. El is the article the, as in the, as in Elohim, the God or the gods, El Shaddai, the whatever that means, and so forth. Okay, oh, the Lord probably. Okay, so the words found in the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis not earlier than 800 BC, because the scribes and monks in Urhai, just now modern Turkey, actually copied the Lishana Artika Sumeria of that Old Testament or Tab Asher, Genesis, etc. into they used that Lishana Artika language that they knew to write those particular Old Testament scriptures. We copied them, right? It gives a few sentences, an account of the origins of the earliest, the oldest, the first civilization made by man, the civilization of the land of Shinar or Sumer, the land of Sumer. They did make a name for themselves, and that name was the Sumerians. So they didn't say we are Arameans or Babylonians or Jews. They called themselves Sumerians, because that's where they were, in the land of Sumer, building the ziggurat or the tower. Until God knocked down it, stopped them from making that tower, and gave them multiple languages, supposedly 72 of them, and they couldn't understand each other, and then they were scattered all across the earth, meaning that Middle Eastern area, not to Australia or New Zealand or the Fiji Islands, right? It was in that general area, in the Levant. In this particular chapter, the next chapter, The author's concern was with the light which archaeology throws on the origin of Sumerian civilization. He had already referred to the doubtful historicity of the Bible, and by that he meant the inability to accept all that is in the beginning of the Old Testament as a true and certain guide to the origin of the world, the genesis of man and the development of his culture from the savagery, if that is the right word, of the Gardens of Eden, through the peasant agriculture of Cain and stock raising of Abel to the city life of Babel and to the ancient civilizations of the Near East, which the Old Testament people witnessed in Egypt, Babylon and elsewhere. But hidden in the interesting congeries of myths and legends, many directly derived from Mesopotamia before Abraham set off from Ur of the Chaldees, are some historical facts, as we shall see, and indeed as it is easy to see nowadays with the hindsight of 100 and more years of archaeological research in Southwest Asia. Noah and the flood must surely reflect some of the floods of inundated Lower Mesopotamia from time to time. Yeah, because apparently, according to the translator from Between, Victor N. Alexander, the Arabic scripture translated to English, many floods happened in the Mesopotamian region. We also have a book called The Timetables of History by Bernard Grun, based upon Werner Stein's Culture File Plan, which states the same thing on page 3. Mesopotamian floods in that region, and that page is page 3, under the heading G, Daily Life, between minus 4,000 to 3,501, minus 3501. Disastrous floods in the Mesopotamian region. So it's hinting there that that's what happened in that particular region at that particular time. There may not have been an immediate global flood as claimed, but it may have came later when perhaps a meteorite from space hit the earth, caused tidal waves, volcanic eruptions, etc., melted the polar ice caps and therefore flooding the whole world. Maybe that's the difference. The story of the conflict between Abel and Cain is a reflection of the conflict between the steppe and the sown, the desert and the irrigated river valley, a constant theme in ancient Mesopotamian history. Sumer is a territory which after 2000 BC was called Babylonia. The plain of the land of Shinar is the land between the rivers, the land between the twin rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The Greeks called this land Mesopotamia, which word means just that, the land between the rivers. It's actually Bet-Naran in the Syrian. Most of it today is part of the modern state of Iraq, or ancient Iraq, although the Euphrates rises in Syria and the Tigris in Turkey. From the Turkish border and the Armenian mountains in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south is roughly 600 miles, about the distance from Aberdeen to Dover. From the Syrian desert on the west to the mountain of Persia, the Zagros mountains on the east is some 200 to 250 miles. In this area, and more especially in the south, the Sumerian civilization came into existence in the second half of the 4th millennium BC. That Mesopotamia had been the homeland of ancient civilizations was of course very well known for a long time. Babylon and Assyria were part of the historical picture of man based on classical writers in the Old Testament. Herodotus visited Babylon in 450 BC and described the great temple or ziggurat there. He said that as a grain-bearing country, Assyria is the richest in the world. The figures given by Strabo and Herodotus for a yield of corn of 200 to 300 fold may have not been widely exaggerated. Jacobson has calculated from the cuneiform text that the yield of wheat in southern Iraq in 2400 BC could compare favourably with that of the best modern Canadian wheat fields, and this may well be one of the reasons for the growth and the flourishing of Sumerian civilization. The fertility and agricultural wealth of southern Mesopotamia when well farmed. The author should of course have said predisposing conditions rather than reasons. He did not want here or at any other point in this book to appear to slip into an easy economic or geographical determinism. The Jews had been captive in Babylon and by its waters had wept, the rivers of Babylon. Everyone knows the dramatic account of the Hebrew prophet Daniel, who was an unwilling guest at Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. During the feast Cyrus's men waded across the river and broke into the city. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And this is the writing that was written. Mene tekel Harston. This was in 538 BC. The Babylonians and Assyrians had ruled in Mesopotamia off and on since 2000 BC. Hammurabi was the greatest of the Babylonian kings and the author of the famous Code of Law, Hammurabi's Law, issued by him, to cause justice to prevail in the country, to destroy the wicked and evil, that the strong may not oppress the weak. Hammurabi's dates have long been a matter for discussion. Professor Sidney Smith argued for a long chronology, and his argument, which gave the date of Hammurabi's accession as 1792 BC, has much been strengthened by recent evidence. You may well ask, who were the Chaldeans and what exactly was Chaldea in the study of ancient peoples and early civilizations? Most people have heard of Abraham as living in Ur of the Chaldees, Genesis 11:28. The terms Chaldee, Chaldeans, Chaldea are frequent in the Old Testament, where they are used as equivalents for Babylonia and the Babylonians. The old term was Mat Kaldu. Possibly at one early stage the Chaldeans were a separate Semitic-speaking people, but soon in ancient history they were indistinguishable from the Semitic-speaking peoples of Babylon. So nowadays when we speak of the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia, we speak of Assyrians and Babylonians, rather than of Assyrians and Chaldeans. By the way, subsequently the word Chaldee was wrongly used for the Aramaic language itself, while in the book of Daniel and Herodotus, Strabo and Diodorus, it means astrologers and astronomers, and the term lived on for a long time to mean wise men. There are two special features which have for long been associated in the minds of historians and archaeologists with early Mesopotamia. The first is the presence of tells, or indications, or signs, or things left behind, from their day through to the present day history, right? And the second is cuneiform writing. Both need some brief words of explanation here. The early houses and temples of ancient Mesopotamia were built of clay, either of pise cob, which is roughly piled up earth, or of adobe, shapeless lumps of clay pressed together. Later, sun-dried bricks were used, and latest of all, kiln-fired bricks, which were naturally more durable, especially when joined together with bitumen. So kind of cement. These kiln-fired bricks were costly and reserved for the construction of temples and palaces. The great majority of Mesopotamian buildings were of clay or mud brick. Rain and natural usage wore these mud clay structures down, and it has been estimated that the average time span of a mud house in Mesopotamia would be about 75 years. New houses were built in a collapsed and scattered remains of the old houses, and so forth. These artificial and steadily accumulating mounds of successive settlements are called towels in Mesopotamia. This is incidentally a pre-Islamic word. This is before Islam went through there. And have other local names in other parts of the Near East, such as Tepe in northern Mesopotamia. That's the one that was found, and had those strange animals on it, etc. And Iran, in Turkey. Sometimes they are very high indeed, and some of them, like Erbil, Old Arbela, and Kirkuk, are still lived in, or perhaps one should say lived on. They have been more or less continuously occupied from early times to the present day, perhaps for 6,000 to 8,000 years. These man-made settlement mounds, tells, tepes, are a feature of the archaeology of Iran, Iraq, Palestine and Turkey. They also occur in southern Russia and in Bulgaria. They are not a feature of the surviving past of barbarian Western and Northern Western Europe, nor indeed of Egypt, where, as we shall see, traces of early settlements are difficult to find. Indeed, one American archaeologist working in Egypt, John Wilson, has called the early civilization of Egypt a civilization without cities. But where tales do occur, they are an obvious place for the antiquary and traveller interested in the past, and for the modern archaeologist with his trenches, sondages and large-scale excavations. This is why accounts of excavations in the Near East are full of numbered levels like Uruk 18, Tepe Gawra 12, a Ninevite 3, and so on. There's a map. Distribution of non-cuneiform scripts of the Near East Bronze Age after the Pope. The two large towers near Hilah in Babylonia and near Mosul in Assyria were pointed to in Jewish and Arab tradition as the sites of Babylon and Nineveh. And these and other sites were visited by European travellers from the 12th century onwards. These travellers often collected bricks and pots, hoods and fragments of tablets from these towers. An Italian nobleman, Pietro della Valle, who wrote a most entertaining account of his journey across Mesopotamia, brought back to Europe in 1625 some baked clay tablets on which were writings in certain unknown characters. This was cuneiform writing, the oldest writing in the world. So it's older than the Egyptian, it predates the Egyptian. The Sumerians wrote on clay with a stylus made of a reed or wood. The first signs set down were pictographic, a kind of picture writing as used by the Chinese. Later the Babylonians used a stylus for setting down a syllabic script. The cut edge of the reed stylus made wedge-shaped impressions, and hence the name cuneiform for this earliest writing. But it was not only on clay tablets that this cuneiform writing occurred. There were also monumental inscriptions. Faced with the writings on monuments and tablets, the learned world of Western Europe began to realise that here was a mystery and a new field for scientific exploration. It's the steles, rocks, caves, etc. Talks here about Rawlinson, who succeeded in translating the first two paragraphs of the cuneiform inscription in Old Persian. In 1846, the Royal Asiatic Society published in 2 volumes the Persian cuneiform inscription at Behistun, which was a complete translation of the Old Persian text, and in the same year Dr. Edward Hincks published an independent translation in the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy. When the Babylonian inscription was available, Rawlinson, Hinks, and others including Oppert, De Salcy, and Fox Talbot, worked at its decipherment. Soon this was done, and the key to Babylonian and Assyrian obtained, but not everyone was satisfied that this was so. When in 1857 Rawlinson translated for the British Museum an inscription on a cylinder of Tiglath-Pileser I, there was some discussion, and before publication it was decided to ask Hinks, Fox Talbot, and Oppert to translate the inscription independently, and this they did. Rawlinson's translation and the three others were sent in sealed envelopes to the president of the Royal Asiatic Society, who had them examined by a select committee. The committee reported that the translations were so alike that there could be no longer any doubt that the true key to the decipherment of cuneiform writing had been found. This was, in the first place, the key to the cuneiform writings of the Babylonians and Assyrians. It took Mesopotamian history back to 2000 BC, but it was also a key to something else, to the Sumerians, whose existence in the land of Shinar no one at that time suspected, except perhaps for Edward Hinks, who with great acumen pointed out that the Semitic-speaking Babylonians could not have been the originators of the cuneiform form of writing, which they themselves used. Babylonian, he argued, was a syllabic writing, and he thought that the cuneiform script was borrowed from an earlier people without syllabic writing. In this he was right, but he posed the question, who were these people? Were they possibly earlier people who lived in the south of Mesopotamia? Serious excavations in Mesopotamia began in 1843 when P.E. Botta, the French consular agent at Mosul, started digging in the Mount of Kuyunchik across the Tigris from Mosul. While excavating there late in 1842 and early in 1843, he learned of sculptured stones found in the mounds of Khorsabad, 14 miles to the north, and at the end of March began work there. Within a week he had discovered the remains of a huge Assyrian palace with large sculptured slabs and cuneiform inscriptions. At once he sent a telegram to Paris. Nineveh is retrouvé. Is it like French or something? Must be French. Yeah. Nineveh has been retrieved, probably. Actually, Botta was mistaken. Khorsabad was not Nineveh, but Sharukin, the city of one of the greatest Assyrian kings, Sargon II, 721 to 705 BC, and it was Sargon II's palace that Botta had found. Nineveh was in fact the site of Kuyunchik, which he had abandoned, but this did not matter. What mattered was that the spade was being used to examine the tales of Mesopotamia. In 1845, Henry Layard began work at Nimrod, and in the 1850s Botta was succeeded by Place, and was it actually Place or Place? Some other funny name like that. And Layard by his former assistant Hormuzd Rassam. Mesopotamian excavation had begun, though admittedly it was often very badly carried out, and no more than a scramble for antiquities. Layard himself described his object in excavating at Nimrod is to obtain the largest possible number of well-preserved objects of art at the least possible outlay of time and money. And Rassam's work was, in the words of Seton Lloyd, an undignified scramble for archaeological loot. Excavations in the south of Mesopotamia, homeland of the Sumerians, also began at this time. At the end of 1849, two Englishmen, W.K. Loftus and H.A. Churchill, rode across the deserts and marshes of southern Mesopotamia from the Euphrates to the Tigris and saw the great Sumerian towns, and to their great surprise, the marks of former prosperity and intensive cultivation. The author quotes briefly from what Loftus wrote of Waka. The desolation and solitude of Waka are even more striking than the scene presented by Babylon itself. There is no life for miles around. No river glides in grandeur at the base of its mounds. No green dates flourish near its ruins. A blade of grass or an insect finds no existence there. The shriveled lichen alone clinging to the withered surface of the broken brick seemed to glory in its universal dominion over these barren walls. Of all the desolate pictures he's ever beheld, that of Walker incomparably surpasses all. Okay, it goes on and about Loftus and then Rawlinson. Rawlinson was able to work on the clay tablets. He identified Saqqara as the ancient city of Lhasa, the biblical Elasar, and Waka as the biblical Erech, today's modern Iraq. And Cush begat Nimrod, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, or Iraq, and Akkad, Arcadia, and Kalna is the land of Shinar. Genesis 10, verse 10. In 1854, J.E. Taylor, the British Vice Consul at Basra, began excavating Tal Mukariyah and a group of mounds south of this at Tal Abu Sharain. Rawlinson was able to identify the first site as Ur of the Chaldees, birthplace of Abraham, and the second as Eridu. The land of Shinar had been found and formed of its ancient cities, Erech, Lhasa, Ur, and Eridu also. It's before said that Hincks, with great acumen, had argued for a pre-Babylonian people from whom the Babylonians borrowed their cuneiform writing. In 1869, Oppert boldly identified these non-Semitic pre-Babylonian people as the Sumerians. The finds of Loftus and Taylor of the Sumerians, but Oppert's theory was that the Sumerians had been in Iraq or Erech before the Babylonians, and Assyrians was not widely accepted. Indeed, there was nothing to show that the finds at Ur, Eridu and elsewhere were much older, if older at all, than the palaces which Botta and Layard were digging near Mosul. The South Mesopotamian discoveries at first attracted little attention. They had yielded no great monumental sculpture. What was needed was some sensational discovery of aesthetic beauty before the world would interest itself or believe in the Sumerians. And that discovery was made by Ernest de Sarzec, the French consul in Basra. In 1874, some Arabs informed him that stone statuettes could be found in a place called Dallo, and in 1877 he dug trial trenches to this mound. In this mound, it found a number of fine diorite statues and many cuneiform inscriptions. He took them to Paris and sold them to the Louvre, and afterwards continued digging at the site intermittently, then under the auspices of the Louvre, or the Paris Museum, until 1900. He was able to show that this was the Sumerian city of Lagash. His finds included many archaic sculptures of the late 3rd millennium BC, including the famous portrait statues of Gudea, the 7th governor of Lagash. His date was sometime in the period 2100 to 2000 BC. The numerous statues and inscriptions of Gudea provided without any doubt the finest examples of Sumerian art and literature, and the discoveries of the Sarzec created sensations similar to those made by the discoveries of Botta in Khorsabad and Layard at Nineveh. They were old and mentioned in the Bible, always a help in the 19th century when it seemed that those subterranean sciences of geology and archaeology were undermining faith, but they were revealed as great artists practicing a new art, that is to say, an art which was different from the familiar conventional ancient arts such as those of Greece and Rome and the Egyptians. From the familiar conventional ancient arts such as those of Greece and Roman and Egypt. By 1900s, the Sumerians had arrived, and by that year, too, their language was well understood. In this century, we have seen the intensive and accurate revelation of the Sumerians by the spade and skill of the translator of Sumerian, and so forth. It has been the intention of the author to introduce you deliberately to the Sumerians by going back to the time when we knew nothing of what their tales or they left behind in cuneiform writing meant, so that you can appreciate how a knowledge of man's first civilization was achieved. In the next chapter, the author would outline the detail of the archaeological finds, and it will be seen that by level 4 at Uruk, you can say that civilization had been born, the first civilization in the history of man, so it predated Egypt. So anyone that says, oh, Egypt came first, wrong. The black people were first, wrong. Okay, you got the information all twisted. The existence of people in southern Mesopotamia in this phase without efficient irrigation is quite unthinkable. The rich and fertile plain was being tilled and it became overpopulated, so that the Ubaid people from the south moved up the Tigris and Euphrates in search of new land. Talks about the Ubaid. In the established archaeological sequence of southern Mesopotamia, the Ubaid phase is succeeded by the Uruk phase, which lasted from about 3,800 or 3,700 to 3,200 BC. The culture of Uruk is already in its maturity by about 500 BC. The sites of Uruk itself consist of 18 levels observed by excavations and deep sounding in the precincts of the ceremonial centre, the ziggurat of Ana, or Ana probably. This deep pit or sondage was about 25 metres in depth and contained in it the accumulated debris of settlements beginning with the people of Ubaid times. The author has already said that archaeologists sometimes label their levels from top to bottom, but at other times from the bottom, the earliest level up. Uruk is another example of the bottom to top method. The first and oldest level at that site is 28 dynasty probably, and the full development of the site is in level Uruk 4. At this time, Sumerian pottery and architecture, or maybe that's the level of the dig, and they named it 28 Uruk 4. At this time, Sumerian pottery and architecture were at the high state of development and contemporary with the great temples of Uruk. 4. We find the earliest abundant evidence of writing. A civilization has been born, the first civilization in the history of man. It's Uruk, ancient cities, now known as Iraq in modern times. A civilization had been born, the first civilization in the history of man, the Sumerian civilization, not the Egyptian, and its date was perhaps 3,200 BC, 5,000 years ago. Chapter 3, the Sumerians and the origins of civilization. It was then, some 5,000 years ago, that civilization began in southern Mesopotamia. It was then, some 5,000 years ago, that civilization began in southern Mesopotamia. In the last chapter, the previous one, this video, it was said that by the fourth Uruk phase, Uruk 4, somewhere between 3,200 and 3,100 BC, we were without any doubt dealing with a society that was civilized according to the definitions